So, Dave, I saw something on social media this past week that really moved me, and it was such a great message. I want to share it with you and share it with our podcast audience at the same time.
All right, yeah.
So I'm watching this blacksmith, and the blacksmith is taking a newly forged sword out of the forge. And she says, take a look at this sword. It's got all of the imperfection that you would expect at this point. It's got forge scale. I don't even know what forge scale is, Dave, but it sounds horrible. It has forge scale. It's got hammer marks. It's got cold shuts. I can't even imagine having a cold shut. This thing had cold shuts all over it.
Oh, you don't want a cold shut, Brad.
You do not want to have a cold shut.
That'll get you.
She goes, it's terrible. It's got all kinds of imperfections, but she says, it is exactly where it needs to be for the next step. And when she said that, my jaw just fell open. It was such an amazing point. This thing is filled with imperfections, and you wouldn't wish a sword like that on anybody, right?
Right.
But it's exactly where it needs to be for the next step. And she said, that's my message to you today. You've got imperfections, you've got faults, you've got this, you've got that, and you may feel terrible about it, but you're exactly where you need to be for the next step. And it was just this wonderful message of, yes, we've got faults, and that's okay, but you're exactly where you need to be. It's not okay to stay full of faults. It's not okay to let those flaws linger.
Right, right.
But it's important to say you are exactly where you need to be. You had to get here to this flawed state. You had to get here to get to the next step. And I wanted to share that with you and get your thoughts, because it delighted me. It's been bouncing around inside my head ever since.
I love that. There's a very Mr. Rogers aspect to that of, you're the perfect person to be you right now kind of a feeling.
Yes.
But it also is a quiet acknowledgement that, no, you're not, even if you're not perfect right now, and who among us is, none of us are perfect, but you're the perfect that you need to be to get ready to do the next step, or to progress to the next step. And that's the fact that there's like an action verb in there. You know what I mean? The need is what makes that phrase interesting.
Yes.
You're exactly where you need to be to progress to the next step is interesting.
You have to be there. You absolutely there. You must be there. In other words, you couldn't get to the next step unless you were where you are right now, flaws and all.
Right.
Isn't that a wonderful thought?
That is a wonderful thought.
Yeah.
I like that it comes through with sword making too. That because you can so clearly think through the stages of hammering out steel and how it goes ever finer and finer.
Yeah.
It doesn't start off as a perfect sword. It starts off as literally a lump of rock, and you melt out the metal in it. Wow, that's great. What a great phrase, Brad.
It kind of goes back to a theme of this show. In fact, I don't know how much we've gone back over it, but we remember we were talking to that guy that said he was ending his 10-year comic, and I said, I wished I would have ended mine earlier. Mm-hmm. Did I ever tell you my wife pulled me aside?
You did. She said, no, you needed those 4 years.
Yeah.
And I thought, what was a great phrase.
That's the same idea. You needed to have that. You needed to, with all those imperfections, you needed that time. And then you were ready for the next step. It's the same sort of thing that we talk about on this show all the time.
Yeah, it's I like that, because the expectation is not put on you that you are perfect right now, nor that you're going to even be perfect at the next step of your life or the next stage of your life, right?
Right.
But that you are the perfect you to get to whatever the next stage is. And there's something quite lovely about that. Brad, that's a great phrase to start the show with. I like that.
You're exactly where you need to be to start this show.
Serving it up on a plate so that I can say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about making comics
and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, editor of webcomics.com and creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his friend Dave Kellett, exactly where I need to be to say I am the cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Strip.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/ComicLab. So Dave, let's talk about that Kickstarter.
Oh, yes. So I am kickstarting right now for folks that follow my work, 2 collections at the same time. It's called the New Pack 2-Pack. It's 2 of my Sheldon books kickstarting at once, and it's over at newsheldonbook.com. Newsheldonbook.com, and that one is going to be available for the next 30 days. Although, based on how we record this show, you probably have about 2 weeks left to.
You better jump on your horse.
you better jump on it because we're probably well ahead of it time wise. But anyway, it's fun to see. It looks like it's going to make it, and it's going to fun, and it's going to go, which is great. And I really think you're going to love this collection. It's over 400 pages when it's all said and done. I think we're going to end up about 432 pages of comics with the stretch goals. So you're getting a lot of years of Sheldon in one big go. So head on over to newsheldonbook.com, and thank you for joining us on that book.
And newsheldonbook.com, that's going back to a ComicLab tip we've had a long time ago, which is if you have something like this, and you're doing a Kickstarter, instead of using that long URL, you buy a short domain that can kind of be general all-purpose, like newsheldonbook.com.
Right.
And you can redirect that to your Kickstarter or to your Patreon. I redirected it during StudioCon. I redirected it to my virtual store so people could buy stuff there. And it's nice to have a URL like newsheldonbook.com that you can just go in, redirect, and that goes to your new thing.
Well, and this is something that we have not talked about, but we've used in the past these things like newsheldonbook.com for short redirects, right?
Yeah.
But you could, as you go through your career, if you don't love your URL, you could conceivably buy other versions that do well in, like, say, audio format, like this does. You know, this is a very speakable URL, and so you have different URLs for different situations. One that's very clickable, one that's very audio linkable, one that's good for conventions. I wouldn't recommend it when you're starting out and building your URL to have 2 or 3 versions, but there's nice advantage to having these short redirects that you can use for specific situations. And so we do recommend this one for things like Kickstarter or Patreon, where you're trying to share a quick link and maybe you don't have the best URL naturally, so you use a short redirect. And that's what we do with newsheldonbook.com. So,
fantastic. Yes. Now let's go from good news to not so good news. As of the taping of this show, just last night, AT&T announced, what did I read? Over 800 layoffs across their corporate structure. And a lot of them came from I don't know whether a disproportionate amount, but DC Comics, which is now owned by AT&T, got hit with some major layoffs, including Bob Harris, editors Mark Doyle, Brian Cunningham, Andy Curry, Jim Lee, who was, I think, chief creative officer and like a publisher, is no longer a publisher, but he stays on as a creative liaison.
Right.
A lot of top editors, DC Collectibles, completely gone. And I think I was reading this morning that DC Universe, which was responsible for a lot of those live action products like Doom Patrol and so forth, they're in really dire straits. What have you heard about it so far?
Well, I've heard much the same that you have, and that the only number I have to add is that the physical comics of DC Comics represent 0.2% of AT&T's annualized income. And so you can see 1,000% where this decision is stemming from, especially in light of the pandemic and comic book shop closures, is that AT&T is saying to themselves, you can imagine the type of person sitting in a boardroom, AT&T, like they're dealing with their mobile contracts across the country, and they're like, oh, right, we also own DC Comics. We bought that for, Superman and Batman, and we don't give a shit about anything else. That's right. Okay. And so you can imagine that type of person is making the decisions here, not someone who is ingrained in love of comics, but sees 2 properties that they can spin movies out at Warner Brothers, right? And 1,000 animated properties. And so we commented on this, Brad, a year or 2 back when AT&T had the big takeover, that the writing was on the wall for what DC Comics would become.
Absolutely.
And that is an IP farm for movies and shows and games and things like that. And now, very sadly, in the course of this pandemic, it looks like that's beginning to come to pass. And I think, personally, DC Comics will still exist. It will still put out books. I think increasingly they will put out books for kids rather than for comic book shops. This might be, Brad, one of the big sad moments of the beginning of the end for the floppy, I think.
I was just going to ask you whether you thought floppies are going to be the first thing to disappear from DC. I think it's pretty likely.
Well, when you get rid of a third, I think it's a third or almost a half of your editorial staff. That's a big sign that like you're not commissioning a lot of new books coming down the pipe.
No, and like I've said for a long time, I think what we will see is maybe some new things going direct to digital. In terms of comics, with the idea that if a couple of those are good and have strong enough numbers, then they will actually print the graphic novel collection of that stuff. But in terms of monthly printed floppies, I think those are going to disappear very shortly. There may be still monthly digital, and then maybe annual print editions is my best guess as to what this is going to shake out as.
Right. But the sad thing is, depending on who you talk to in the industry, it's still a profitable venture for DC Comics per se to produce comics. I know that sounds ridiculous to say out loud, but I believe it is still profitable. But the problem is for AT&T, it's a lot of noise and banging for very little profit by their standards. You know what I mean? And that's where the problem is. They're really trying to streamline their operation. I do think that they are going to go increasingly digital and direct to consumer, like you said.
Yes.
Whether that means they start to bypass Comixology will be very interesting to see.
Oh, yeah.
And start to offer, and I don't know why they didn't do this before, especially on an AT&T platform, a DC Comics we own it all, and it's not through Comixology. And if you want to read Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, you got to go here.
Right.
But it's kind of a version, Brad, you remember we were talking about last week with the Eisners. I don't know that 3 years from now, at the other end of this pandemic, we're not going to find that all comics are digital.
No, absolutely. And particularly, again, we know AT&T loves to streamline. It's what made them one of the top corporations in the world. They're going to streamline all of this stuff. And that means that, a lot of that publishing and stuff that doesn't fit neatly into the package is likely to disappear. They're just going to get cut. And again, like Dave says, a lot of type of books for children, they're going to go that whole route towards the young adult market. And take a look at what they did just during the pandemic. I think, didn't they, after Diamond said that they weren't going to deliver, they just started doing business with these two other alternate distribution channels that popped up to fill the gap. And now I think they've cut ties with Diamond entirely, and they're probably going to end up cultivating that distribution until they finally end up cutting print floppies altogether.
Yeah, I do not want to be negative Nancy because it's about an industry that I love, but I think that it's a lot of that is just moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. It's like, now we're with Diamond, now we're not with Diamond, now we're with these two other guys, now we're doing our own thing. And all of that is in the context of comic book shop after comic book shop after comic book shop closing down permanently in the wake of a pandemic that doesn't allow people to go in and physically browse comics,
Yep. And if you're, so what would you say to a creator that is looking at this, and maybe you've had a couple contracts with DC and you're justifiably frightened right now? What do you say to a creator like that in terms of what this place in comics history means?
First of all, how can you do anything else but express sorrow and sadness for them and just say, I am sorry, friend, that this is happening to you? Yeah. Because you did everything right. You worked your butt off for 10 years, 20 years, and you got into the NBA, You were an all-star shooter and you got into the NBA, and now all of a sudden the NBA is folding. And that breaks my heart. I saw that happening in comic strips a decade ago, and it doesn't make it any less painful for me now to see it happening in comic books. It breaks my heart. It was a system that was set up post-war, distribution model perfect for newsstands and for little convenience shops, and they were sold everywhere. And frankly, it had long outlived its business model in the sense that comic book shops increasingly made less and less sense especially in the last decade or two.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it doesn't break my heart. So much talent out there. So many wonderful people, Brad, that we know and love at comic conventions and online and through their work and having beers at shows. And they love comics and they work so hard and they personally did everything right. And it breaks my heart to see this happen to them. And then I guess your question was, what advice do we have? The sad truth is there is going to be a period of pain, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. And the light is you can own and control your own career.
Absolutely.
And Brad and I are living proof of that.
Yeah.
And it will be hard and there will be years of trying to figure it out. But your talent and your creativity that made you an all-star at DC and soon that made you an all-star at Marvel, even though that is not a home to you anymore, those same talents can be applied to becoming an independent cartoonist and maybe a happier creator independently in the long run. So the light at the end of the tunnel here is that you can own and control your own career and that the same talents that got you into DC can make magic in making your own independent career. Don't you think, Brad?
I think it's good advice. In other words, if I was in those shoes, my first call would be to somebody at Marvel Comics saying, hey, I got some time on my hand. But I don't know that that's the advice that I would give. In fact, obviously you got to make the mortgage payment. You got to do what you got to do. But putting Marvel aside, I think no matter which decision that creator does in that circumstance, I think the real thing that they've got to start looking at is developing their own creator-owned properties and start figuring out what it means to be a self-publisher. And they have the talent, they've got the skill, they've got the brain power, they can do this. I think at some point we're going to look back 5 years down the road and see that an awful lot of people took a look at this moment in comics history and realized that it was an opportunity. And it, like many opportunities, it sure doesn't feel very good in the moment.
It feels terrifying, yeah.
But later on, I think they're going to realize this was an opportunity. At least that's what I hope this all ends up as.
Yeah, it's like that cliched saying of the same Chinese symbol for crisis is the same symbol for opportunity, and I think I have that right in saying it that way. I don't think I have it wrong, but anyway. But yes, this moment is terrifying and terrible, and no one wants to be living through this. But there is a moment here that it's kind of, Brad, the Image comic moments for DC is that you could have a chance here to build and create something that is your own. And like Brad, I don't think the immediate answer, I mean, go for it, but I don't think the immediate answer is to call a friend up at Marvel and be like, hey, you got any jobs? Because I think Marvel is 6 to 18 months away from making the exact same decision, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, and so do that. Do whatever you have to do to survive in this moment. But I think in the background, please, please, please be building something that you can own and control that is a digital-based, low cost to start. Put your talents into that book you always had in the back of your mind that you never pitched to your DC editors because you're like, ooh, this one's too special. I'm going to keep this one for me. Now is your chance to build that book and make that story public.
Oh, absolutely. Just to put a capper on this, remember, the reason the Fantastic Four got published in its issue #1 was that they were carting furniture out of the offices of Timely Comics to pay off debts. They were a week away from getting shut down entirely, and they're like, well, they're going to do one more print run. And Stan's like, what did we have to lose? We did the one book that we always wanted to do. It was different than anything else that we'd ever done. Everybody said no to it. Nobody liked it, but we loved it. And as they don't have a chair to sit down on anymore, they put out Fantastic Four #1, and that was the birth of Marvel Comics. To keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. This may be your Stan and Jack moment.
Can I take a 3,000 feet in the air view of this too, Brad, for a second?
Yeah.
Here is the silver lining for cartoonists like you and I, Brad, is that the competitors here are ceding the field to independence. The big corporations are basically taking their ball and saying, we're going to go play with movies and TVs. we don't want to do comics anymore for the most part. You can see that happening, like obviously they'll continue to do digital platforms. They'll continue to make books for kids. But what's happening is they are largely taking their IP that is worth billions and saying, let's make movies out of this. Who gives a shit if this individual Batman whatever book made $10,000 in profit, made $100,000 in profit? That is literally a rounding error to AT&T. We don't care anymore.
Yeah.
We're just going to make movies. So they're ceding the field to independents and people that like us who truly love comics and readers who truly love comics. And we're like, no, I still want stories like that.
Yeah.
And so we are going to be, historically speaking, if you look at this from 30,000 feet up, we are going to be the artists that are still providing those stories when the corporations start to move away and cede the field,
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you've got exactly the right line on this.
So I guess what I'm saying is 2 to 3 years from now, there's actually great hope for doing what we do because the Warner Brothers and the Disneys will, in big steps, move away from making physical books and comic stories that are new and original in order to just capitalize on the IP that they already own, decades worth.
Absolutely. So, Dave, turning now to the heart of the ComicLab podcast, I've got a question from one of our Patreon backers that I am dying to hear your thoughts on.
Okay, let's do it.
This comes in from Jeff, who says, "Hey, Brad and Dave, first let me say thank you for all the great advice and entertainment. I currently have an hour drive to work, and your podcast has made that drive 1,000 times better."
That's awesome, Jeff.
My question is, with the vast majority of comics today utilizing color, is it still viable to do a black and white comic? Black and white is cheaper in terms of printing and offers the opportunity to offer color exclusives on Patreon, but will black and white comics lose the interest of potential readers? Thanks in advance.
Jeff, this is a great question, and we wrestle with this one every few years, and the answers remain largely in the same ballpark, but it's worth revisiting. So this is a good question.
Yeah.
So I think Brad and I would argue that if color could at all be applied to a comic, then do it. Because black and white comics were largely created for the technical limitations of newsprint and of early stage floppies. And the fact that you now can do color and you can apply it, even bare bones, simple flat palette color within 10, 15, 20 minutes in Photoshop, and bada bing, bada boom, a black and white comic just went to a color comic that argues for the visual appeal of a color comic, right?
Yeah.
But now, does black and white still work? Is it still viable? Yes, of course, it can still work. And here's why. The comics where the idea is central, it's either a joke or it's imparting some bit of knowledge, or it's mainly gag and humor and joke a day kind of comics, where it's just the idea. Black and white still works great because it's all it needs to do is service getting the idea out.
Yes.
But comics that try to attempt to do anything more than just service an idea, either character development, story development, a visual that looks amazing, anything like that, it augurs for color. Don't you think, Brad?
Yes, absolutely. In other words, if the writing is strong enough, if the comic is good, if the comic is really well done, and that means writing, it's not really going to matter so much. And this is particularly true, like Dave said, for like a 3-panel or 4-panel comic strip. You can, in fact, I was looking through my Twitter feed, and honest to goodness, an awful lot of my favorite short form comics are black and white. We've talked about Adam Huber, who does Bug Martini. Very simple drawing style, straight up black and white. Steve Ogden, who does Danny and Dax and Magnificats, has a wonderful drawing style and a very good handling of humor writing. Black and white, it doesn't have a problem.
No.
Now, the problem with that is most of us may not be operating at that level, okay? And if you're like me, and I absolutely found myself here, I needed an edge. And especially when in the early days of Evil Inc., when I first started working with a colorist, I jumped at that opportunity because I knew that my writing was good, but my writing wasn't great. And in the meantime, if I could make the images a little bit better, I might have an opportunity to keep a few people. So
Right.
and also, let's face it, particularly the younger people that you're hoping to sway, they may be expecting a color image. They may recoil a little bit when they see black and white. And
Right.
again, if your writing is solid enough to keep them, they'll become converts very quickly. Sarah's scribbles it isn't hurt a bit
No.
by being black and white, right?
No.
But there's somebody who really knows how to connect with their audience. So in my mind, does black and white hurt you? No. Does color help you? Yes.
Yeah, what a great summary. That is a great way to put it, Brad.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I got very excited because that was such a good summary. It was so clean.
But now also take a look at, we were talking about short form humor. We're talking, 3-panel, 4-panel comic strips. Take a look at this young guy that's out there doing some great stuff. This Dave Kellett, he started a sci-fi strip, not a short form, a long form. And it is not quite black and white, but you chose to use a monochromatic shading scale. So it's not just black and white line art, it's shading, but it's certainly not full color. Talk about the decision that you made to go there.
Well, so a part of that was the science of the possible, or the art of the possible, rather,
Yes.
the science of the possible. For me, I knew that I didn't want it to be black and white, but I knew that I barely had enough time at that point to create a drive page a week, in addition to the 7 pages of Sheldon or 7 comics of Sheldon that I was creating a week. So I was like, what is the art of the possible here? And I said, okay, well, a single monochromatic, or tone-on-tone comic would be doable. And here's where you have to give a shout out to the others. We all learned from our peers and those in around us. And there were a couple of comics, I think Blankets was one of them,
Yes.
that had done this before me. And so it's not like anything I invented. I absolutely learned from my peers on this. I was like, oh, you can find and create a really nice tonal comic using one color and get a really nice spectrum out of it. And so for me, blue-gray was a really nice range, because you could portray the darkness of deep space and the light tonalities of facial expressions using that spectrum of blue,
Right.
blue-gray. And so that's why I went with that. And for me, it worked, because it gives you the sense of this is not black and white. It's not bare bones, but there's just a hint of a little color to give it a little splash, and it was both workable and repeatable. That was the big thing. It had to be repeatable for years on end. And as it has turned out, I've actually come to really enjoy working that way. So
now it's a definitive look. Now, if I read a Drive comic that was in full color, it wouldn't feel like a Drive comic. This is now part of the experience.
Yeah, in fact, Beth did Beth, a colorist and project lead on the studio there. She did a really lovely color version of when I did a spoof Drive Alpha Flight cover.
Yes, I remember that.
And she colored it, and it came out beautiful. And I cannot say a bad word about it. I absolutely love it. But it even for me as a creator, it's weird to see them in color,
Yes.
And
yes.
so that's how established that blue-gray is in my own mind's eye now, that is the world of Drive.
Yeah.
And what's great is now when people see a Drive like floating in the wild, they know it because just based on that coloring alone, which is nice. It's almost a form of branding if you think about it.
It's very much the same for Erica Moen's Oh Joy Sex Toy.
Yes. Perfect
that is
example.
Often, if not monochromatic, it is sometimes duochromatic. She'll use a magenta and a blue. And again, very limited options, but just enough to make that image pop. And also go along to another one of my favorites, Giselle Lagasse, who does Pixie Tricks and Eerie Cuties. That's all done with a very manga style halftone shading, where they do those what we old timers call Ben-Day dots. And she uses that really loose screen so that you can see the dots. And of course, by the way, there's a method to that madness too. If you keep that line screen loose on your halftone pattern, you don't have to worry quite so much about moire patterns forming when you reduce the size of the image for print. And that's exactly why they do that.
And Brad, real quick, because that's a good teachable moment. For someone who's never heard of a moire pattern before, give them the quick 2-second version.
So what happens is, okay, so first of all, we have to talk about what a halftone screen is, and that is basically a bunch of dots that are formed on a grid, basically, that form a gray shade when your eye looks at them. In fact, if you ever do get a chance to see a newspaper, you look really closely at the
also,
images.
I think for younger people, manga uses them
Yes.
a lot.
Absolutely.
And so you'll know it if you just think of
those dot shading patterns, okay?
Right.
So what happens is when you reduce those, if those dots are too close together, they start to form little patterns inside the halftone screen. So what'll happen, and not pretty patterns, like these jaggedy, weird patterns that are very distracting. They'll form stripes and zigzags.
They confuse the mind,
Yes. Well, because your eye is always trying to find patterns. So as soon as some of these dots line up, your eye goes, oh, there's a pattern. And then boom, it springs right up and you can't not see it anymore because your eyes are trained for that. So that's why in a lot of manga, you notice the dots in the grayscale. And that's specifically so that they could reduce that and also reduce the chances. If at some point, by the way, as a tangent, if you reduce it enough, you run the risk of getting a moire even with a very loose halftone screen. But this reduces the chances of a moire pattern happening.
Right.
But again, there's one that's a very limited palette. Most of the manga that we keep talking about, we love so much in the Shonen Jump books that are coming out of Japan. Those are all black and white. Nobody says boo about it. Right, or whatever, whatever the same thing is in the Japanese language. Nobody says that about it because again, it's well written. Again, it comes right back to that whole idea: is it going to hurt you? No, but is color going to help you? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I think that is the perfect summary on that, Brad. And once again, Brad Geiger wins the day. Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics. Well, Brad, I'll tell you who else has won the day. The sponsors of today's show, the good folks at Wacom at WACOM.com, the makers of the new Wacom One, and we thank them so much for, the kindness of sponsoring this show for such a long term.
Yeah.
They are a company that has made a lot of art careers possible in this digital age. And it is really a kindness and a shout out to them that they are continuing to sponsor the podcast as we go through the years here. So we want to thank them for not only their kindness, but also for making that fantastic Wacom One over at WACOM.com. And Bradley J. Geiger, our next question from patreon.com/ComicLab comes in from Michael. And Michael writes, "Hey, Brad. Hey, Dave. I've been developing a story that I believe is best told in long form that involves 2 main characters and a small cast of secondary characters. My question last month answered by Brad, and his guidance was to work out getting to 10-page stories first. I appreciate you. Remember that question, Brad? You advised
this was
a shorter
the guy that
story
said, I want to write long form, blah, blah. And we said, hey, listen, buddy, you got to write some short form first. Because before you get into all this other stuff, write some short stories and prove and get that under your belt. Then tackle that bigger thing. Yeah, I remember this.
Right. And so Michael continues. He says, I appreciate that I need that as a new writer. As I have been working on these short stories, I find that I have not defined the main characters well enough to myself in my own head, and I know that there is no way to know for any reader. I was thinking about using small, 4, 6, and Sunday strip lengths to develop and test aspects of their personalities and voice. Would it be too jarring to have a strip that is really variable length from post to post? I always wanted to explore the traditional newspaper format, and I figured this could be a good way to establish character need, desires, and flaws. P.S. I don't mean to write throwaway gag strips. I would like the strips to still live in the story timeline and be a part of the greater story. Well, Brad, I have a lot of thoughts on this one, but we'll let you jump on first. What do you say to Michael about this thought of introducing and using a Sunday strip format to explore the needs, wants, desires of a character, and yet still have it part of the archive of that story on the site itself?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan, and there's a lot going on there, a lot in that question that needs to be unpacked. But just first of all, the concept of a Sunday strip. In fact, somebody on Twitter, I think just recently, I was kind of challenging them on this because they were talking about doing a Sunday strip. Or no, I think it was in the Discord server of ComicLab, to be honest with you. But I said, why a Sunday strip? Why do you got to do a Sunday strip? Same thing. Oh, I when I was a kid, I loved Sunday comics, and I always wanted to be in newspapers, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, that's all great. That's great. I totally get it. But this concept of saving color for Sunday and doing a longer comic on Sunday because it's Sunday, is so anachronistic, and it so doesn't fit with the audience that you're hoping to build,
right?
That you're actually causing problems trying to carry that concept over and make it fit a completely different publishing landscape. I think you're inviting a lot of trouble to your life in trying to resurrect that Sunday strip idea. Remember, Sunday comics were Sunday comics because A, it was more expensive to print in color, and B, their Sunday paper was like their big seller for the week, so that they gave comics more space. They gave everything a little bit more space because they wanted it to be a real special thing. All of those things that I just mentioned, other than color printing, is still more expensive. But for web comics, for independent comics that you're doing your first pass on the web, none of that applies to what you are doing. Not panel count, not color, not any of those things. It's not more expensive to do color pixels than grayscale. All of the decision making that you're making, trying to pull this idea from newspapers and make it fit in web publishing, is leading you towards making, I think, bad decisions. Am I off base, Dave?
No, and actually, there's, like you, I feel like there's a couple different things to unpack in Michael's question. So I would like to tackle them in the same way you're tackling them. So the first one is the format. And like Brad, I do think that the Sunday format is a relic from an age that no longer needs to exist. Yes, it's lovely. We all still love Calvin and Hobbes Sunday comics.
Yes.
But here is the truth about a Sunday comic. That was a technical and business limitation that no longer exists, such that today, every day could be color, every day could be Sunday length. So the very fact that we even think of that as a Sunday comic is anachronistic to a time that doesn't need to exist anymore, right?
Right.
It's a situation that doesn't need to exist anymore. So I am much more of a proponent now for a gag a day or an idea strip being the length it needs to be to service that day's joke.
Yes.
That's sort of been my attitude now. So if it is a single panel comic, I will do a single panel comic. If it's a 5 panels that I did the other day for a grief comic, then it will be 25 panels. And so all of that would have been impossible in a newspaper format because and who cares, because I'm not trying to service newspapers anymore and their specific technical and business needs. So from a technical standpoint, it's kind of like, and frankly, I'm sensing a theme here in this week's show. Yeah. The reason why floppies got started as comic books, right, was because it gathered together X amount of material from newspapers and resold it on newsstands as just comics. And here's whatever it was at the time, 26, 32 pages of a floppy from that month's collection. And now, and then once that format got started, people started to say, well, why don't we write to that format? And we will make a Superman or a Detective Comics or this or that, right? But once you take a step back and go, wait, why are we still making floppies anymore? Oh, because they did it in the 30s and 40s? Well, that's weird.
Right.
And so I feel the same way about Sunday comics as I do about newspaper or comic book floppies, in that it's servicing a different time that no longer exists. And one of the best ways you can make decisions in your comics career, and I will share this because it works in so many different times and formats, is if I was starting this process now, out of nothing, ex nihilo, right, how would I be starting it? And would you choose to start comic book floppies? No, absolutely not. Would you choose to start Sunday comics? No, absolutely not. And so operate from that perspective, and you'll see that those historical and frankly a little anachronistic comic formats just don't make sense anymore from a format standpoint, right? Now, let's jump into Michael's question about, does it service the building of the characters? For me, Brad, a Sunday comic and comic strips in general were idea a day or thought a day or joke a day, right?
Right.
And their purpose in that format was to capture either a joke, an idea, or a thought into one concrete and discrete shape, right? Whereas what Michael is trying to do is create a long-form story of which this is part and parcel of it. And so for me, that's reaching into the toolkit and grabbing the wrong tool for the job. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Michael's trying to be tricky. I think he's trying to sneak one past us. I'll tell you. That's what I think. So again, and he brought it up. He said, "Hey, you asked this question last month, and we gave you an answer." And the answer was, you need to write a short story. Remember, we said about 10 pages.
Right.
He's trying to get away with doing these little Sunday strips, and that's going to serve the same need, right? It's going to serve the same purpose. It's not. You certainly, I get that you certainly can tell a story, a very, very short story, in a 7-panel Sunday strip or in an 8-panel Sunday strip. I get that. And there is worth to that. There very much is worth to that. But it's not the same exact thing as writing a 10-page story. You've got to take those same tools that you're using to do a 7-panel short story. You've got to take those tools and extrapolate them. And that's a necessary process. That's something that is worth doing for you. That's something that will be beneficial once you do it, and that I want you to learn how to do it. But doing these Sunday strips is not the same. It doesn't take the place. I know that you want to do it because just if I had to guess what's going on in your mind, you don't want to take that advice that we gave you last month, and you think, oh, I can make Brad happy by doing a couple of these Sunday strips. I can get the old man off my back, and I can go back to doing what I wanted to do in the first place.
Right.
Well, Michael, I ain't going to let you do it.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in here because I want to acknowledge Brad's wisdom in saying, God, don't do the long-form story yet. Don't attempt it yet.
Oh, please don't.
Because you immediately, Michael, are already seeing the problem here is that you yourself don't know, in your own words, I have not defined the main characters well enough to myself in my own head. And so in trying to do these short stories, if it's coming up short, you're proving Brad's point is that we all need to work it out in smaller chunks first before we attempt that big thing, right? And so here's a possibility that you might want to consider. If you're just not responding to these short stories that Brad is proposing because in your mind you can't, quote, use them. You know what I mean? They might not exist well on the site once this thing goes up. I want to argue that maybe not everything that you create is usable for putting up on the site, right? This is also a possibility. I have argued in past ComicLab episodes and in past ProTips episodes that for a lot of long-form stories, what you really want to be working on in lieu of doing a short story is a character Bible, is a story Bible, is all the background stuff that you know and that you need to know about your characters before you even begin writing, because it will inform whether they drink coffee or tea, or whether they went to college or didn't go to college, or whether they're married or divorced. All the things that will maybe not have a hugely impactful thing on the story, but let you flesh out and color their life, right? It's like if you ever hear about certain authors, they're like, oh yeah, I worked more on my story Bible than I ever did on the novel. novel. But I needed to do all that in order to write the novel because I needed to know all the nuances of their life before I started. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I'm saying just do something like that.
Right.
Take a weekend and just work out what was this character's background? What was his childhood like?
Yeah.
What was her educational days like? What was their first career? Whatever it is. And in doing that, you will come to know them better so that when it comes to write these short stories, you won't find yourself coming up short.
Yes, and I would also add that I'm a big proponent of doing a character Bible, but going back to Dave's original point, if you're thinking, well, I don't want to do this 10-page story because it's not usable, my mind immediately says that's a Patreon exclusive. Just like we said in the last show, these side stories, if it doesn't fit in the main thrust of the story, bingo, you just got yourself a 10-page Patreon exclusive. Keep doing them. This is wonderful. This is not a problem. This is a benefit.
Right. And there's another thing, Brad, that we're not considering here, whereas Michael was saying that I was always sort of curious to explore the traditional newspaper format. And like you said earlier, Brad, good, that's great. You should explore that. Knowing how to work that tool will be one more thing in your toolkit as you go forward as a cartoonist, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. But maybe, Brad, I would like to propose a different idea that we haven't considered yet. Maybe a tiny part of Michael's heart is telling him he doesn't want to do long form.
Right.
If he's having trouble doing a 10-page story and he's at the same time going, I always kind of like Sunday comics. Nothing wrong with that, but maybe this is your heart's way of saying you'd rather be writing a gag a day or an idea a day or something like that rather than doing a story. Just something to consider, Michael.
Whether that's the truth or not, it definitely reinforces that he should be writing shorter stories until he gets his sea legs. If he's saying these characters aren't fully formed in his head yet and he doesn't know, where this is going, all the more reason to be doing a short story. So, Dave, I've got another question I want to ask, and this one comes in from Susan Marks, who says, "Hi, guys. I love the ComicLab Cocktail Hour. I've listened to a number of the more recent Writer's Room episodes. You seem to focus on turning a scene into the best joke or punchline. Do you ever wrestle with plot or character development? My graphic story is not humorous. Thanks for always being there now more than ever." Dave, these writers' rooms, we keep trying to go for the punchline, and of course we talk about that an awful lot. Why don't we do a writer's room that's like a long-form story writer's room?
Well, Brad, this is a good question because Writer's Room serves a very unique purpose. And what we do on that show, for those folks who are not yet Patreon pals over at patreon.com/ComicLab, we record a second podcast every week that is actionable advice, actionable tips and tricks, and really gets down to the nitty-gritty quickly. And then as parcel of that, we also do Writer's Rooms, where Brad and I will take in half-formed, semi-formed, brand new thoughts and say, let's work this out together as writers in a shared writer's room. And by the end of this episode, hopefully we will have a finished idea. Right? So that's the basic idea for Writer's Room for folks that are not familiar with it. But this question makes me laugh because what we try to do is make that half hour as interesting as possible for a process that can be akin to watching paint dry sometimes,
Right.
So we tend to focus on humor and idea-based writing because at the very least, you're learning how we do it while laughing, right? That's the goal there. So absolutely we struggle with plot. Absolutely we struggle with character arcs. Absolutely we struggle with story points.
Right.
But that process, and I can only speak for myself, Brad, sometimes that process is me staring at a blank wall for 6 hours with a pencil in my hand and a tiny bit of drool on my lip, going, because I'm stuck. Like, for the outside world, it looks like I've gone comatose, but the wheels are turning in my head,
Yeah. No, I mean, to answer your question, we could do a writer's room that was long form. It would go from 30 minutes to, maybe 6 hours, and a lot of it would be completely silent. You would not enjoy listening to that writer's room.
No, yeah.
But let's take that a little bit further back, because this ties perfectly into what we were just saying. What we do in those writers' rooms for jokes is absolutely giving you the tools or helping to share some of the tools that you need to do long form storytelling. But you need to meet us halfway. You need to take those lessons and extrapolate them into what you're doing. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean.
Yep.
When I do my storytelling class at University of the Arts, in fact, we're starting up pretty soon here at the end of the month, and I'll be giving them my opening day lecture, during which I tell them a lot of stuff. But one thing I always tell them: if you want to learn how to tell a good story, learn to tell a good joke. Because it's all there. The concepts of tension and release and building expectation and subverting expectations, hyperbole, misdirection, all of those things that make a good joke make a good story.
Yes.
But like we just got done telling Michael, it isn't a one-for-one type of thing. It's not an exact transfer of tools and experiences. You've got to extrapolate it. You've got to say, okay, I'm going to take what I learned writing this joke, and now I'm going to write a story. But again, you got to meet us halfway. We can't do that writer's room where we're going to do a long form because it's impossible. Again, it would not be good. But you can use that writer's room to learn how to write a long form story. But you got to meet us halfway on that, don't you think?
Yeah, to Susan, to say it a different way, it's a great question and a valid question. But to Brad's point, it would make for terrible radio, if you know what we mean. Like, for most people, they wouldn't understand the nuances of where Brad or I are in our specific plot for our specific story that are now years in, right, with character development and story development. So we have to make a lot of assumptions. People would have to assume that they know where Drive is or where Evil Inc. is in a storyline. They would have to know the background story, all that sort of stuff. And then they would have to also invest hours into the show where we talk about plot or character development. So it's a good question, but what really Brad and I are trying to do is we're trying to share and impart certain lessons, like Brad said, in writing joke and punchline stuff that you can bring into your own writing. And what are some of those lessons? Well, the basics are saying yes and during the brainstorming phase, right? And actually, I should step back. There's two basic phases to a writer's room. There's the brainstorming phase, and then there's the editorializing phase. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to turn off your editorial hat for the first bit of your writing. And your editorial hat is the one that says, no, that's a dumb idea. No, that won't work. No, that can't be done. No, that I've seen that before. Because what you're doing in the brainstorming phase is you're giving yourself permission to get through the bad ideas to get to the good idea, right? And sometimes that is a volume proposition, not a qualitative proposition. It's a quantity proposition. You've got to get through 100 bad ideas to get to the one good one, right? So you'll hear Brad and I in those sessions saying yes and a lot to each other, laughing at, acknowledging the greatness of an idea, and then quietly maybe ignoring it in the sense of like, let's move on to the next one, so that we can find the truly great one. So that's so the idea is of editorializing only after you're done, brainstorming and then editorializing, saying yes and then also maintaining an openness to an out-of-the-box idea that at first blush is inarguably stupid because that can get you to the good idea.
So, Dave, I've got one more question from one of our Patreon backers at patreon.com/ComicLab to close out the show. And it's kind of another one that's in a little bit of a theme here that we've built throughout this show. All these questions kind of have a little bit of a common thread. So I'm really liking that everything fell together like this. This one comes in from Jim Kessler, who says, please explain your thought process when choosing a color palette for the characters in your respective comics. Does it go beyond the obvious, quote, a duck is this color, unquote? I already have a villain with this color costume, unquote. Thank you for your show. Your enthusiasms for the art medium is a weekly tonic for the creative soul.
That's
Thank
nice.
you, Jim. Yeah, that's super nice.
Well, I have to say, first of all, thank you for the kind words. And secondly, you have asked no one better in this world a question about color than the guy who is red-green colorblind on this show. Boy, I am ready to, I'll tell you what, Brad's, nothing's going to stop me. Get ready for an hour answer on this from the colorblind guy.
Yeah, stand back. Hey, listen, and by the way, even though I'm not medically colorblind, I said a long time ago, I'm not color is not my strength. I was thrilled when I was able to hire a colorist, and I so much am out of my depth there that my colorist Alex Heberling has carte blanche. That's the only color I worry about is blanche. She's got carte blanche to do whatever. Like last week, I introduced a new character and found out that he's got purple hair, and I'm fine with that. In fact, I want that to happen. I want my colorist to have as much ownership and agency over that aspect of the comic as possible. Not only do I think that gives better results, but again, I'm out of my depth on that, and I know when to admit that. So
Yeah.
we will say right up front, we are two people that maybe not the best folks to answer this question, but it's not going to stop us, right, Dave?
Well, yeah, I will say, to echo what Brad said, you can go back on our show listings and look for Alex, her interview at, I think it was about a year ago.
Yep, Alex
And
Heberling.
then Beth Reed Miller, who came in probably 9 months ago, I would think, Brad,
That
show-wise.
sounds right.
And both of them had excellent points and guidelines about color, and frankly are better on the topic than we are. But I will say just a couple basic things about character design and color. And one is to think of character when you're doing a new character in a comic. We've talked before about the profile test, where if you just took their profile, would they stand out from other characters in your comic? Or does everybody kind of have the same problem, or the same profile? Because if they do, that is a problem.
Right.
And so with color, I personally think you want to have a family that works together. You don't want to have some jarring color that pops out in a huge way. Let's think of them like the X-Men. If everybody had a certain family of colors that worked well together, and then someone was like, orange, like something very different,
Yes.
that feels like it's from a different world. You always want to have consistency. But at the same time, I think like the profile test, you want to have a contrast that even if you see their forearm in a shot, or if you only see them shot from behind and you only see half of their body, the color itself lets you know who you're talking with and dealing with in that moment on that panel.
Right.
You know what I mean? So you want it to have it to be self-identifying enough so that even if a section of that character is seen, you're like, I know who that is, that kind of a thing.
Yeah. And also, I would say, so here's the problem that I see a lot of people falling into. In fact, I was just doing a consultation for somebody that was, it just as I do, struggles a lot with color. And all of his reds are fire engine reds. And all of his blues are deep, intense blues. And the first thing I want you to do is maybe find a couple of comics that are out there that you think are colored well. And basically, I'm going to say steal those comics, not the content, but to bring those into Photoshop or whatever you're using for color, and eyedropper those colors and try to use as much of those colors as possible, and try to use as much of your own color choices as little as possible until you start to get a feel for it. Because there's a real problem with every red being an intense fire engine red. And if you can't see that with your own eye, if you can't mix that, or if it doesn't come naturally, and if it isn't a skill that you're picking up quickly, take some comics that you think are beautiful and put those over in another window and eyedropper those colors, right?
Right. And I have done that many a time in speaking as a colorblind person. I've found two ways to sort of work around the edges of being colorblind. One is to logic my way through it in Photoshop by saying, all right, I'm going to go to the percentages. And if I take 10% more cyan and bring down the yellow a little bit, I can kind of figure out, even though I'm not seeing it correctly, mentally what I'm probably seeing. But that's a bad substitute. And so to Brad's point, what I have done in the past is like, well, I know I want to do a sunset, but sunsets are particularly troublesome when you're red-green colorblind.
Yeah.
That change, that transition from blues to pinks to reds that you get in a sunset. And so I was like, who's done a sunset well? I know there was a Calvin and Hobbes Sunday that was set in the Southwest, and there was a sunset. And so I literally went to that comic, and I was like, you know what? Click, 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 click. I'm going to use the colors that Bill used. And it came out probably okay. Certainly better than if you allowed colorblind McGee over here to go to town on it. So yes, I wholeheartedly co-sign Brad's thought there. But as far as designing characters, Brad, do do you find yourself making a choice when you did it that like, all right, well, Lightning Lady is this color palette, so I need to make another character contrast or different or the same or in the same family? What was your thought process of that?
Not so much. In other words, they've each got their own, and I'm sure Alex will tell you that that they all are in harmony with one another. But really, it's more about what color that character needs. And in other words, take Lightning Lady as a great example. You've got lightning as a main part of her costume. Well, that's either going to be yellow or white, or it's going to be one of those two colors, right? It may be a light blue, but chances are it's going to be yellow or white. A certain amount of those colors are chosen for you. Now, once you've made that color, the yellow, you're locked into towards your second color. In other words, it's not going to be red because yellow and red are not going to evoke lightning. It's not going to be orange for sure. It's not going to be green. It's going to be a darker blue because that's kind of like a night sky type of color. And that is going to evoke that idea of lightning the best. Same thing with Miss Match. She's in a red costume that's got reds, yellows, and oranges. Fire colors, right? Some of this is some of it is kind of obvious or maybe even trite, but some of it is the idea of once you make your key color decision, like this is a key color, yellow is my key color, a bunch of your other decisions start to get made for you because there are either there are some combinations that just aren't going to look good together, or there's some combinations that are going to immediately evoke a feeling that isn't right. For example, yellow and brown, right? Now, this is not the colors that you would use for a fire type character or somebody who's really energetic. Yellow and brown immediately says old fashioned, daisies on the wallpaper, maybe a dish towel that your grandmother had, right? These are all evocative of those color combinations in a lot of situations. Right. So all of a sudden, what I find when I'm doing color, and usually doing it not so great, is once I make one decision, a bunch of my other decisions start to fall into place very naturally.
Absolutely. And they start to feed off of one another.
Yes.
And I will say this too, that let's take it. So Brad's characters are, in both those cases, and great examples, he was talking about superheroes that he was drawing. And superheroes are quite literally a hyperbolic expression of human emotions, right? So those are clear, easy distinctions to make. But I will say that when you're coloring day-to-day slice of life characters, right? Like you've got a librarian, a lawyer, or this or that, whatever it is. Keep in mind that if you have a character for whom decisions are tricky and they're a little bit milquetoast as a personality, you don't want to put them in red. You want to have the color choices reinforce who that character is. So if they're kind of milquetoasty, you want them to be in light tans and browns and khakis. And I don't make a lot of waves in the world, and I'm just, what I mean? And then if you have, in the same way that people have that power tie that they wear when they want to pretend that they're an alpha male, whatever it is, And so you want to dress your characters in colors that are appropriate or reinforce, or maybe sometimes even ironically work against character that they have in the strip itself. So color can be your friend, like profile, like costuming, in telling the audience who this person is before they even really get to fully know them.
Right. And one final thought before we wrap things up. And this is something that they teach you in art school that is actually way more useful than you give it credit for. Squint at your drawing as you're working in color, or step back from it and kind of lose a little bit of focus. What people very often make the mistake of is remember I was talking about all those super saturated colors. They've got a person with a blue shirt standing in front of a blue wall. And both of those blues are 100% intensity blues, right? Right. And when you squint, the person disappears because the blue of the wall and the blue of the shirt merge. Remember, even when you've decided on a hue, even when you decided on one category of color, there's all kinds of shades and highlights of that hue. That hue can get darker. that hue can get lighter, that hue can get grayer, that hue can go back in intensity from 100% to 90% to 80%, all the way down to 0%. There's a lot of different ways that you can play with that color so that you're not using every color at its 100% saturation or the 100% strength of that hue. You can play there, and you should. You should step back and you should squint your eyes and allow yourself to lose a little focus on the image so that you can see how the colors are playing with each other. Don't you think?
I think that's a perfect way to summarize it, Brad.
Yeah.
And I got to say, for two people who rely completely on others to do their coloring for them, we did a great job of pretending like we knew what we were speaking about.
Absolutely. We faked our way through that very nicely. And if you want to hear two ladies talk about this with some intelligence, Beth was on the show number 101. She was on episode 101, and Alex Eberling was on episode 47. So if you want to hear two people talk about this with authority, look up those shows. They were fantastic.
Absolutely.
And you know what else is fantastic? The fantastic part is you've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com. I literally caught myself.
And my good friend Dave Kellett, co-director of Stripped and cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com, and whose Kickstarter is going on right now. Jump on it while you can, and that's at newsheldonbook.com.
That's right, newsheldonbook.com, and the Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode and all episodes was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode like this one. 5-star review coming in from Lowbats Now 13, who says, Brad and Dave are funny and smart. They focus on creating comics and making a living doing that, but much of what they talk about could relate to any other content creator or any other situation. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to as a comics fan.
That is very nice. And honestly, it's one of the continuing themes of praise that we get that, look, I'm not even a cartoonist, or I don't even do this or that.
Yeah.
And gosh, it's really nice to see. And I frankly agree with it that some of the best advice I've gotten in my own cartooning has come from a guitarist or from a stage dresser for theater or this or that, just aspects of living a creative life. So that means a lot to us, those kind of words. Thank you for that. And I will close this out by saying Comic Lab is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice, patreon.com/comiclab. So I'm going to share this for folks that listening at home now. We had a lot of technical problems recording this show, and at one point, Brad could see me but not hear me. And he literally said to me, "Sweetie, I can't hear you. Is your mic on? Sweetie." There's 1,000 ways to write it. Did I lose you, Brad?
Oh, sweetie, I can't hear you.
And I 1,000% love the fact that he said, sweetie, your mic's not working. Sweetie, because it felt like, what is it, 1952? Sweetie, your mic's not working.
No, I felt so bad because you were so genuine and you were so just going full bore, and I'm like, this is gonna be so disappointed, but his microphone is off. I can't hear him anymore. I actually use Sweetie an awful lot. There was one of the few times somebody really got like nasty with me on social media because I was saying something about how I was talking to my son, and I said, Sweetie, you got to be careful about that or whatever. And the person said, you call your son Sweetie? And I go, yeah, I call both of my sons Sweetie and Honey and whatever else is on my mind. They're both kids with very sweet hearts. Why wouldn't I call them Sweetheart? And they're like, well, that's what are you doing? You're not raising masculine kids. And I'm like, go fuck yourself. What do you mean I'm not raising masculine kids? But yeah, that's the one time I got pushback was when I said something about calling my kid sweetie.
Sweetie is that is just a phrase that I felt like I was being transported to another time by hearing Brad say, "Sweetie, your mic's not working."
Well, sweetie, it's time to end the show.
All right, sweetie. We'll see you next week, sweetie.